All right, Module 10, Groundwater Rule. You're going to open your book, follow along. These are your manuals to keep, to write in. If you have any questions whatsoever as we're going through, again, very laid back, open class, feel free to do that. How many of you all operate groundwater systems? All right, so the majority. How many of you all are familiar with the current groundwater rule and what you have to do because of the groundwater rule? How many of you all collect? Test. So you do your monthly back tees from your distribution system, right? Basically, in a nutshell, what the groundwater rule is if there is a positive from the distribution system, not only are you doing those repeats within 5 connections upstream, 5 connections downstream, but you must now also, and the original site, you now must also go to your wells, your sources, and collect additional samples there and test for fecal contamination. So in a nutshell, that's what this rule is all about. Now, does that mean that EPA thinks that a lot of groundwater is fecally contaminated? No, but have there been cases of fecal contamination in groundwater? Absolutely. And because of that, we have to address those issues. So in this module, we are going to look in depth at the groundwater rule, the requirements, how do we comply with the rule, and the monitoring and the testing. We will start with an overview of the rule, and we will identify various methods for compliance with the rule. Now, although initially probably most of us got our water from groundwater source, but because population grew and we were pulling so much out of the ground, we've now gone to a lot of surface water. A lot of your major cities are probably doing surface as opposed to groundwater. Another issue with groundwater is subsidence. However, still 33% of all public water systems still rely on aquifers, which are underground water-bearing formation, to provide them with water. Typically, when you're looking at groundwater and surface water, groundwater has already been treated somewhat because of the filtration process. So we don't see the same contaminants in groundwater as we see in surface water. Do you agree with that statement? Okay, cool. But because water is the universal solvent, whatever that water moves through, it will pick up those impurities. So there are still some contaminations with groundwater. If you have, again, a soil very high in mineral, as the water matriculates through the ground, most of those minerals will be dissolved into that water, hence leading us to possible contaminants. Well, there are other contaminations that can get into the water outside of just the dissolving practice. Landfill and hazardous waste sites. How do they affect our groundwater? Leaching, very good. Over time, liners and things like that can break, and so you can have a leaching into your groundwater system. California, a few years back, MTBE, from their underground fuel storage tanks, had some leaching of that into their groundwater. So it is possible. Agricultural, this is a very agricultural state here with all the crops and things. Is there a catch basin when farmers irrigate those crops with the pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizer? Do we have a catch basin for that water? Where is it going? The ditch? So it is going into our surface water and matriculating down into our groundwater. So hence contamination, impurities there. Mining, we have storage tanks that can also contaminate groundwater sources, as well as septic tanks. Now, do you all still have quite a few septic tanks? Yeah, yeah.
And sewer ponds in Louisiana.
Oh, sewer ponds. Oh, no. When I first got in the business, true story, I started with a private operations and maintenance company in Houston, and they were also in my home state in Mississippi. They won the contract there. So I had the opportunity to actually go to my home state to do some inspections and so forth, and to work there a while. My dad, they were still on the septic tanks. And so he had a backup. You know what he did? And just really, I'm like, Dad, you can't do that. I'll have to turn you in now that I know better. Now, in his case, I honestly believe he didn't know better. He didn't know better. But we have cases like that do occur, or as he says, become the swamps, cesspool swamps now, out of ignorance. But however it gets there, it still can contaminate our surface as well as the groundwater. So we have to do better part of education there. And then we have the oil, gas, and industrial injection well. So lots of possible contamination, even for groundwater sources that are somewhat protected. Now, the Groundwater Rule was finalized in 2006. The goal of the rule was to reduce the risk of exposure to fecal contamination. Now, when we talk fecal contamination, what are we talking about particularly? Sewage, intestinal waste from warm-blooded organisms. Why are we trying to reduce this sort of waste? Because pathogens can live and grow in the intestines of warm-blooded animals and organisms. And so because of that, that's why we have this groundwater rule. However, EPA does not believe that most groundwater is fecally contaminated because of the process of matriculating to the aquifer. So the purpose of the rule was to take a risk-targeted strategy. It was first of all to identify those groundwater systems that are highly sensitive and at a high risk for fecal contamination. And how do we identify? Testing. As Mr. John said, you're going to have to test, do the surveys, do the legwork. This rule also specifies when corrective action is required. And how do we know when corrective action is required? It will normally be triggered by positive coliform, positive E. coli in the distribution system. Now, when we look at the Safe Drinking Water Act promulgated in 1974, the first major amendment in 1986 required all public water systems to disinfect or to chlorinate their water. The second major amendment, 1996, kind of backed away. They did the moonwalk backwards. And they said it was not necessary for all to provide disinfection, but groundwater sources were to disinfect as necessary. So that opened up leeway for some people who are apprehensive to utilizing chemical to opt out of using disinfection for the purpose of treating groundwater, only as necessary to protect the public health. Since then, through studies, they've discovered that there may be a need to provide some type of disinfection because of the occurrence of waterborne diseases or pathogens and viruses in the groundwater. Gastrointestinal symptoms rarely require medical treatment. And what's meant by that, normally if a pathogen virus passes through the system, if you are a healthy individual, yes, you may experience some diarrhea, discomfort, however, it will run its course. If you're very young with a weakened immune system or undeveloped immune system, old with a weakened one, or if you're compromised with some type of disease, you are more susceptible to the bacteria, to the pathogens that passes through in the form of or in the water. And sometimes it can lead to very severe cases and even death in some cases. In addition to all the previous ways that we said that groundwater can be contaminated, if we have a compromised well, the casing is not cemented right, the grounds are not sloped appropriately, we can get possible contamination in that groundwater source through, again, surface contamination also. So part of this rule, doing the sanitary survey, is actually going out, doing physical inspection to see where your source is, where your wells are, to look at your casing and all of that, to make sure it is properly constructed as well as maintained. So there are 4 components that the Groundwater Rule places emphasis on. Number 1 is the sanitary survey. Now, how many of you all have had the opportunity to experience a sanitary survey? Okay, cool, got it done? Yeah, the first round was completed 2012. Now, doing that process, Randy, how much work was required of you?
It was, actually, this is my second one.
Okay.
I don't know if Louisiana started surveying a few years earlier, but it was painless.
Okay.
They came out and they inspected the well houses and how it was configured. If you
The
had
schematic and all?
had enough casing above ground, vented properly, and it was clean. That's one thing.
Yeah.
It's clean. If it looks good, chances are it is good.
Okay, so perception means a lot in this business.
They won't look quite as hard if it's
Got all the grass grown up around the well? Yeah, absolutely. Did they require you to pull a lot of paperwork?
no.
No, you didn't have to do that?
They just wanted to see the current
Okay,
paperwork that where we, you know, you have in Louisiana you have to check at least twice a week for free chlorine, and it was painless.
painless. Okay, very good. Some cases it can be as painless. John, was that your experience also?
Yes, relatively, unless we get a positive.
And then they look a little more in depth. Yeah. Yeah, and in some cases they can actually ask you to have available anywhere from 3 to 5 years of data and things like that. They'll want to see your flow, your schematic of your plant, doing the survey. As long as you have all the documentation necessary, then it should take a couple of hours or more. Sometimes they may have to make additional visits if you don't have all your ducks in a row. But pretty much they're filling out a form to make sure that there are no deficiencies. That's what they're looking for. And if there are any deficiency, how do we fix them? How do we make it right, basically? Yes, sir.
The minor issues that were found, they officially send it to you in a
Right, a letter.
form.
Uh-huh.
And they give you, I think it was 45 days or something.
60 here.
to apply.
Okay.
And basically what I did on those things, after the issues were resolved, then I took pictures
Very good.
and sent back to them, and they didn't come back out. They could see what they needed to see.
Right, very good. Good documentation on that too to show that it was done. Yeah, and it's very critical to be responsive when the state or the health department, I'm not sure in Louisiana who does a sanitary survey, it varies from state to state. It's DHH. It's very, 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 very important to be responsive and be responsive within the timeline. because there again, I got in trouble because I didn't move fast enough to rectify something that my state wanted done, and they did come back out, and so we got a little, enforcement. So you want to make sure, again, you know who your representatives are and you are responsive to them during that whole process. So for most sanitary surveys, they needed to be conducted by December 2012 for your community system. Now for your outstanding performance, they are given until 2014 to comply with the initial round. What do we mean by outstanding performers? These are the ones that have had no violations, no deficiency, no problems, no issues, okay? And usually when you fall in this category, you can be put on a reduced monitoring on a lot of different things that people are not aware of. That's why do look through those quick reference guides that's given on that disc, because you may not be aware that you don't have to do something every 3 years. You can request for reduced monitoring if you have a stellar record, more or less. Another component of the groundwater rule is the source water monitoring. Now this would be triggered by those positive coliforms in the distribution system. So we'll see when you have the positive in the distribution system, they want you to go to every well that's in production on that day, pull a sample and test for fecal contamination. And then if it is positive, you got to go back within 24 hours and do 5 more samples, or the state can opt to tell you, instead of the 5 additional samples, we want you to move directly to corrective action. EPA has given the state that leeway. Corrective action is the third component, and then after corrective actions have been taken, you got to do the compliance monitoring. So if you're going to introduce a new treatment technology, you got to prove that that treatment is working on a consistent basis. That's the compliance monitoring, that's a part of it. So we're looking at 4 areas: surveys, source water monitoring, corrective action, and compliance monitoring. All of that makes up the groundwater rule in a nutshell. With the sanitary surveys, these are the 8 areas in which every state must cover. They all fall up under EPA. EPA lay out the ground rules, more or less, or the guidelines. Each state then that has delegation has the authorization, or they can choose to be more stringent. So the state of Louisiana can add more stuff to this if they so choose. But typically these are the areas that they're looking at to identify deficiency. They're going to go to your source and check your source out, your treatment, in which you're going to have to, again, show what type of schematic you have, what type of treatment, what chemical you're adding. And I'm on 10.5 if you're following along with me. They're going to ask questions about your distribution system, and you got to pull those records because in Louisiana, the farthest reaches of your distribution, you have to maintain what residual? 0.2 milligrams per liter. Okay, so you want to make sure that you're never dropping below that. If you drop below that in this groundwater rule, what they say, once you've dropped below the 0.2, you're supposed to be collecting samples every 4 hours until it's back up to above 0.2. Right? None of you all ever dropped below 0.2, right? Yeah. Never. All right. They're going to look at your finished water storage, your ground storage systems, and Jason's going to go in detail on all of that. Your elevated tanks, if you have elevated or standpipes. They're going to ask you about inspection, corrosion control, and things like that with your storage. Now, are you all required to inspect your tanks on an annual or triannual basis? At all? Yes? Every 5 years? Okay. And some states are a little more stringent, but every 5 years. Okay, good. They're going to look at your pumping facilities, controls, and things like that. as well as your monitoring, reporting, and data verification. On the data verification, if you're running chlorine residual, how do you ensure the residuals that you are running are indeed the correct residuals? How do you do that? Well, I calibrate my meter. Where are the records that show your calibration? Where are your standards? How old are your standards? Do you all calibrate your meters? Because y'all are looking at me like, what? You mean we got to calibrate the meters? All of that information must be documented, and they have the right to request it. Now, based on, again, who your inspector is, they may not ask you for any of that. But then you may have some inspectors who want every I dotted and T crossed, and you got to pull all the records. So you got to be ready for it. And then operator compliance as well as system management. Do you have the correct number of operators based on your population? Because EPA says based on population, you got to have so many operators operating. And your operators have to have the correct certification. And so they are going to ensure you have the right operators as far as certified operators to run your facilities. And they have to be in compliance with the state requirements. So all of those are components of the survey that they will investigate. Source water monitoring. Now with the source water monitoring, you're testing for the presence of E. coli, enterococci, or the coliphage. E. coli because it's more specific as far as the intestinal waste. That's what we see in intestinal waste. Enterococci is when you have the brackish water, is what's more prevalent there. And then, or the coliphage in the sample. Now, this is triggered when you cannot achieve a 4-log reduction of viruses. It will trigger this source water monitoring, or when you have a positive coliform in your distribution system. So either one of those will trigger the source water monitoring. John, you have to do your source water monitoring? Yeah. How did the samples come back? Negative, okay, and then you were like, shh.
Well, it's still required the following month to do additional samples.
Right. It's just like the distribution. You get that positive, the next month, you're pulling 5 more samples. Yes.
The following month, follow up.
Yeah. So that part, you're absolutely right. Assessment monitoring, the state has the option and the authority to require the system to conduct source water assessment in order to identify high-risk system. And that goes back to the leeway that the federal government gives your state if they want you to do an assessment. With this assessment, they can also ask for geological studies to be done. Is your aquifer in a sensitive area? So it can get very in-depth if the state wishes to go that way. The third component would be corrective action. And when the state comes out and they do the inspection and do the survey and they say you have a deficiency, what do they want you to do? Correct it. Correct it. Not rocket scientists. Correct it. Bessie, you got sludge in your receiving stream. You need to correct it. How do you correct it? And that's where the options come in. In my case, should have got out there and vectored it out. Didn't happen. Enforcement. So whatever deficiency they say, you got to figure out a way, how do we rectify this deficiency? Another corrective action, eliminate the source of contamination. Always an option. If I can get rid of the source of contamination, not a problem anymore. I can also find an alternative water source. We had a well that was high in radioactive materials, and so as far as Trail of the Lakes, what they decided to do, instead of trying to physically remove it, because it was cost prohibitive to do that, they capped the well, abandoned the well. Less than a mile down the road, drilled another well that did not have the same problem. that's another water source, and it is considered a corrective action. You can choose to buy water from someone else. That's another water source that could be considered a corrective action. Or you can prove that you are achieving the 99.99% inactivation or the removal of viruses, and usually that will involve employing some other additional treatment technology in order to achieve that. Sometimes it could be just as simple as disinfection. Or some of you all may have lots of money and say, we're going to put in an RO system or some other type of membrane, reverse osmosis. Once you've made that decision, compliance entails making sure whatever treatment technology you've installed that you can reliably achieve the 4-log inactivation of the viruses. Clear as mud? All right, we talked about the sanitary surveys. Now, as far as the requirements for the surveys, they're on page 10.6 in your book. For non-community systems, every 5 years. What's a non-community system? Okay, like a transient, like a park, absolutely right. Like a daycare, like a factory, like a hotel, like a motel. You got the picture? So with a non-community, you're still looking at 15 service connections, 25 individuals for at least 6 months out of the year providing potable water. Okay? Your non-community can be transient and they can be non-transient. Transient, hotels, motels, people are coming and people are going. Non-transient, your rural schools, and I think I saw somebody's in here from a school with their own, did I see that? Yeah, okay, you're here from a school. And so you have 25 of the same individuals, so non-transient for at least 6 months out of the year. So your non-community systems, they're going to do the surveys every 5 years. Community water system, the only difference is the length of service provided as far as potable water. For your community systems, we provide potable water year-round basis. And they are doing surveys every 3 years. If you have a community system with an outstanding performance records, you got 5 years, every 5 years. All right, now for small entities, EPA says a small water system is any system fewer than 3,300 people. It always goes back to population. For your small systems, triggered monitoring, in other words, what's going to trigger my source water monitoring, I got to collect source water from each well within 24 hours of that positive coliform from the distribution system. How often are we collecting the distribution system sample? Once a month, right? So it comes back positive. Now, once it's positive, I'm automatically going back to the original site, pulling a sample within 5 connections upstream, pulling a sample within 5 connections downstream. That's already, and that goes with the coliform rule. In addition, with the groundwater rule, now I got to go to that well source, each well that was in production on that day, and pull a source, test for fecal contamination. Now, if my repeat distribution samples are negative, I'm good, right? But if one of them comes up positive, what I got to do? Okay, do the same thing all over again. Likewise, if one of my source is positive, within 24 hours, I got to pull 5 more samples. Not the 3 like the distribution system, I got to pull 5, okay, within a 24-hour period. The state has some leeway here. The state can say, we're going to give you extra time to pull those 5 samples, or you don't have to worry about pulling the samples. We want you to go to immediate corrective action. A lot of times it deals with the size of the entity. For larger systems, they're going to make you do the corrective actions almost. Yes, sir. Yes, it is. Prior to treatment, Danny. Thank you. It must be prior to treatment. Because if I go after chlorination, what should I expect? Absolutely. I should expect to pass. They want to actually see what's happening at the source, whether the source is compromised or fecally contaminated. Yes, sir.
So that's 5 more samples per well that you had on during that duration?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Now, the other thing is, and I think I said that the state will look at a case-by-case basis. They have some leeway to grant you more time for pulling samples and so forth like that. They also may require you conduct assessment source water monitoring. Again, that just how they view you a lot of times, unfortunately, whether or not they will determine you that that's necessary for you. Okay, and then they may also go as far as the additional geological assessment necessity. And if you're getting positive from your groundwater, it's more likely they'll go this route. In other words, if I have a positive, my repeats are positive, something's wrong, we need to rectify the problem. So you may end up in one of these studies. Okay, the other part of compliance monitoring, and I think you have this on page 10A. Again, we're going to be, because I say we're going to be because it's for smaller systems. However, I did see that quite a few of you all were from large systems also. So A will be applicable to you. If your system serves more than 3,300 people, you are to continuously monitor and maintain state-determined residual concentration that provide the for-log inactivation at or before the first customer. Every day, the system serves water to the public. Every day. If you are a smaller system, you're going to pull these samples every 4 hours until you're back up to the residual level, which is the 0.2. So that's the difference in between the large systems and the smaller system. And typically you'll see that as far as regulations, the larger systems will be doing a whole lot more monitoring, and the frequency of monitoring is much more stringent than your smaller systems. If you're operating membrane filtration or an alternative treatment technology, then what they want you to do is to basically prove that your system is working. Prove that your technique works the way it should be working. How are you going to do that? You're going to do additional assessment and monitoring analysis of samples. Okay. Now, the other component of this, if you will look on 10.9, unless the state, and I'm mid-page, unless the state directs you to take specific corrective action, you will consult with them, and then they'll usually give you approximately 30 days in order to make certain corrective actions. Usually when the lab notify you of additional samples that are fecal coliform positive, or notification by the state of significant deficiency, you are to be in contact with the state within 30 days telling them what you're going to do to correct the problems. They will give you up to 120 days. I heard earlier 60 days. Now again, each state has the authority to be more stringent. So your state, although EPA may be saying 120 days, your state may say you got 60 days to comply, and they have that right to do that. But EPA says you have 120 days to correct any deficiencies. If the state says to develop some type of state-specific plan to stay on track for compliance, you still only have the 120 days put your plan together, submit it to the state. Okay? Or in your case, the 60 days as designated by your state. Does that make sense? So again, it's state specific if they choose to be more stringent than EPA. And what we're giving you basically is the broad, what EPA says, then each state will modify that to meet their needs. Okay, now, and I've said that if they say that you can use treatment or disinfectant as a corrective action, you got to do the additional analysis in order to make sure that compliance or that your technique is effective. Now, in addition to notifying the state, keeping them informed, guess who else you have to keep informed on what's going on? The public, your customers, absolutely. Every time anything happens to that water source, you got to notify them. Why? It's their water, it's our water. You are the protector of the environment for your customer. And yes, you are a customer too, right? And so they have a right to know what's going on with their water. In the old days, we used to operate and do things, and it was like, okay, we got it taken care of, so you don't really need to know about this. But we have so many people today with compromised immune system, they need to be aware of what's going on so they can make those educated decisions as to what to use for water sources. So we find the public notification rule as being a part of the groundwater rule also, where there are 3 tiers of notification. Tier 1, 2, and 3. The first one is for anything that's acute. Acute is fast acting. Acute is something we need to get that information out there ASAP. If there's intestinal waste in the sample, that's something we need to respond to right away. Why? Because we don't know if that person or animal that put the waste in the water, if they are pathogen or if they have pathogens in their body or systems, right? We don't know if they're carrying disease. We don't know how to react to that. So how do we react? Right away, contact the public, whereas they can boil water or do something to ensure their safety and protect the public. So tier 1 is anytime I have a groundwater source that has fecal contamination, that's an acute risk. I have 24 hours to notify did I say 24 or 25? Did I say 24? You know how sometimes you're listening to yourself and you get confused? You have 24 hours to notify the public for an acute incident. So fecally contaminated groundwater, that's a 24-hour, that's a tier 1. Tier 2 notification is not so serious. However, I still have to notify the public. With the tier 2 notification, I have 30 days to notify the public. So what falls under the tier 2 notification? Tier 2 notification would be failure to collect the source water fecal contamination. So, meaning, I got a positive in my distribution system. With the groundwater rule, it says I need to go and collect my source. Suppose I don't do that. That's a tier 2, meaning I didn't do what I was supposed to do. Not that fecal was found, I just didn't collect. I got 30 days to tell the public I screwed up, I didn't collect. Now, does that get you off the hook of the collection? Not at all. You still have to go back to the state and deal with the state from not having to do it, which means there is going to be, again, increased frequency of collection. And I don't know how you all are on enforcement. In some states, it can be enforcement attached to it also. But 30 days to notify your public, I screwed up. If you fail to correct any deficiency within the state specified time, like the 60 days, didn't do it, you got to notify the public that you didn't do it. Now keep in mind the state's still coming after you, but you still got to notify your public. If you fail to meet performance, monitoring, or reporting requirements that shows that you are meeting that 4 log, you got to notify the public that you're not doing what we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing as the protector of the environment. So how many days do I have to notify for Tier 2? 30, very good. For Tier 1s? Super, super, super. For Tier 3s, do you think they're more stringent or less stringent than the Tier 2s? Less, yeah. So I have 24 hours for the first tier, 30 days for the second tier. How many days, months, or years for the third tier? 1 year, very good, 1 year. You have 12 months to get this information to your public. So what will be a Tier 3? If you fail to collect the source water after a total positive coliform from your distribution system. What's the difference, huh? Well, and that's where I'm going. Thank you, Arthur. You're leading me right there. Because he said Tier 1. And I want to make sure that we understand that it's different from the Tier 1. What's the difference in a total coliform positive and an E. coli positive? Daylight and dark. Severity. I like those. I like those. Give me something else.
One of them has got indicators, and the other one is actually positive. Got indicator bacteria that shows you it could be possibly in there.
All right. Can we tweak that just a little? Okay. All the coliform bacteria are indicated organisms. The difference being you have fecal species, you have non-fecal species. The non-fecal species, which are the total coliform, are naturally occurring. I probably got them on my skin right now. They're in the water, they're in the soil. Yeah, they're all over. Man, you go out there and plant a plant, you probably have picked up them. Okay, those are non-fecal though, but they're naturally occurring. The fecal species will come from the intestinal waste. So I know I got poop in the water when they show up, not a doubt, okay? Non-fecal, you probably are not going to get any type of disease that's going to take you out. The fecal, there's always the risk, the possibility, we don't know, that the disease is there. And so, Arthur, that's the difference. That's why this total coliform positive, oh, it's something that can be, but it's not really serious. With total coliform, we have 30 days to notify the public. They're actually looking at modifying and changing a rule to look at, because right now there's an exceedance of the MCL when you have a positive total coliform, greater than 5% if you're collecting 40 samples. They are changing, whereas instead of total, they're looking at E. coli because it's more specific of intestinal waste. But that's the difference between the two. If the state requires assessment source water monitoring, that's a Tier 3, or if your significant deficiency is not corrected by the next CCR, that's a Tier 3 too. Now the CCR, the reason they make that little input, because generally you can alert the public, you can notify the public through the CCR when you have Tier 3. So what's a CCR? Yeah, Consumer Confidence Report. That's that annual report they get by July 1 every year, right? So you can use that as a Tier 3 notification process. All right. Questions on the groundwater rule? No questions? No comments? Clear as mud? Yes.
Did Texas basically lay off all their sanitation officers like Louisiana did? And we collect our own samples now?
Well, no, we didn't lay off and let me phrase it like this. We never had them in the first place. You all had it good. We have always been since I've been in the business. I've been in the business now 25 plus years, got started when I was 3 though. We have always been a self-regulated, a self-monitoring entity. In other words, it's always been in place. We collect our own samples. We decide which laboratory we want to do the analysis. Now they do stipulate you got to use a certified laboratory, but they don't tell us we have to use a state lab or this particular lab. And so there's all kinds of competition with private companies, private laboratories. We've been doing it for years. Matter of fact, the company that I used to work for, Eco Resources, had its own laboratories, and quite a lot of the private operation maintenance companies, they did it all, one stop. And they handled, operated mud districts, did the analysis because the laboratories were certified. So we've always been a little different. When I go into states, and Delaware was one, and it was like, gosh, do you know how good you got it? Where the state collected the samples, ran the samples, and I think they were paying like $7 for a back T sample. It's like, man, that's unheard of. And then the operators were complaining when the state people were not getting there when they wanted them to be there to collect and all. And so I'm like, gosh, that's good. So in Louisiana, y'all had it like that too?
It didn't cost anything.
It didn't cost anything?
No longer.
Wow. See, you don't know how good you've had it.
Well, and there was a lot of concern
Uh-huh.
that, a system with chronic problems, those problems may go away when they start doing their own sampling.
And I have to address that too. My company, again, had a policy which they had to abolish. If you went 6 months with no violation, you got a little bonus. And so you find in a situation like that, with incentives like that, people tend to fudge and pencil whip. But we have so much oversight, not just from the state level, but internal oversight too. My last position at that company was environmental controls manager, which I was the policeman, the most hated person in the company, because we didn't want the state coming in. We wanted to catch what our operators were doing prior to the state coming in, because a lot of times with private companies, we indemnify. All that money is coming out of our pocket for each of the mud districts that were fined by the state. And so there's lots of oversight, probably too much with companies like that, so there's not a heck of a lot of the pencil whipping or just not doing or problems going away. Yeah, so we find it to be good.
Still collect $3.20 per meter connection
Mm.
for doing the service. Now they have discontinued doing the service.
And still,
Connection is still ongoing.
oh yeah, they gotta pay for all of, yeah. So we've always had it different. I don't even know what it would be like to live in a state where all of that was done for you. And I don't know. I guess that's why we have so many private operation maintenance companies in Texas,
You
all
don't
over.
have to buy your own bags and
Uh-huh,
paperwork.
uh-huh.
They still furnish us that.
Oh, see, that's good. Usually the laboratory is the one but it's all in the cost of running the analysis. Absolutely. It has to be sterilized, the whole works. You have to provide your own ice packs and stuff like that, or ice. So, yeah. So I'm jealous of you now. But when I visit Delaware, and it was like, I don't even know, I think I want control. And because we've always had control, it's kind of hard to give that control to the state to come and pull samples. When the state people come out there, even for inspections and so forth, our guys have their own kits. They're pulling split samples.
They don't trust them.
Not that we don't trust them. We just want to make sure that they calibrate it right, because again, all our ducks are in a row. So we want to make sure everything's the same, because when it's not the same, then we need to do something differently, and hopefully it won't get us that deficiency notice there. All right, good deal. All right, we're going to look at a short video, about 17 minutes, and then we'll take our first and only break. If at any time you have to get up and go to the restroom or take a quick smoke break, quick being the operative word, just find yourself back in here within a minute or two. Most of this information will come from Module 16. Can you hear that? Okay. Because we're not coming through the system. Oh, wow. Yeah.
or may be located in the homes of customers. The faucets should be carefully selected to provide samples that are representative of the water in the local main and not of the customer's plumbing system. Sampling faucets should not be located near the ground and, if possible, should be inside a residence or building to avoid environmental contamination. Faucets utilizing separate controls for hot and cold water should be chosen, with only the cold water tap used for sampling. Faucets that use a single lever control for both the hot and cold water should not be used. Do not sample from homes or businesses where the water has undergone additional treatment like a water softener, carbon filter, or any point of use treatment device. Avoid faucets located in industrial, janitorial, or cleaning supply storage areas where the risk of accidental contamination is high. Such contamination can occur on the faucet or during sample collection. Here's an example to illustrate how faucet contamination can affect sampling results. A few years ago, the City of San Diego Water Department had an incident of total coliform positive tests, not alarming, but still unusual compared to past experiences and thousands of tests a year. The problem was traced back to samples taken in schools, libraries, and community centers where the water was being collected from drinking water fountains, kitchens, and bathrooms. The problem was multifold. Poor pressure in drinking water fountains meant the sample collected represented water that had been fairly stagnant in the pipes. Also, kids had been placing their mouths directly on the faucet. The sinks in the bathrooms and kitchens were suspected of being prone to environmental contamination, such as from water splashing. There was nothing wrong with drinking water. The samples were simply showing the presence of bacteria at the tap, when in fact the water coming from the distribution system was free of coliform bacteria. Contamination that comes from unsanitary or unrepresentative sampling taps results in costly and time-consuming repeat sampling. Even worse contamination events must be reported to the state agencies and to the public, which undermines confidence in their water supplier. San Diego overhauled the sampling program, installing permanent sampling stations, and went from 5 positives per week to 0 per week at those locations. Other water utilities, like Philadelphia, have addressed the same issue and have installed dedicated sampling stations that have experienced improved data quality. They provide an opportunity to quality control and detect sampling non-quality conditions such as sampling locations fixed and
After this right here, 15-minute break if you want to come in and measure. Okay, about what time is that?
It's probably got about another 5 or 10. We'll still be in here, but you're welcome to come in here because they're bringing lunch.
mixing or churning of the water as it flows from the tap. Remove any aerator on the tap before sampling. Taps with aerators should be avoided.
About 5 or 10 minutes.
Some water suppliers, such as
Mhm.
Sanitary Survey, have installed permanent sample taps. They provide an opportunity for quality control and can save time and money for the utility, since the sampling location is fixed and under the control of the water provider. It is important to remember that to get a good sample for testing is using proper sampling techniques. This ensures that you have not accidentally contaminated the sample yourself. Improper sampling techniques are often the most common problem from sampling. Mistakes made during sampling may result in poor data quality for monitoring. The key is correct sampling in the field, which begins with preparation and execution. Begin by assembling all of the sampling supplies needed. These include sterile sample bottles, extra bottles in case one gets dirty, gloves which will take samples without contaminating the sample, and clean coolers to store the samples in with ice or cold packs. The laboratory that will eventually test the samples usually provides the container or recommends one. Pre-sterilized glass containers may be used if unfilled during shipping. Plastic tends to be a more popular choice. A dechlorination chemical agent is needed if sampling waters contain residual chlorine, which is present in the distribution system. This chemical is already in pre-sterilized sample bottles, so don't wash out the bottles used for total coliform sampling. After arriving at the sampling site, check the tap to make sure that it is in good working condition. It should be clean, free of attachments, and in good repair or without leaks. Remember to remove any aerator and to make sure the hot water is turned off. Some water utilities use alcohol or chlorine solution or wipes to clean faucets before or between uses. These methods are not always necessary if the sampling site and tap carefully selected and maintained. Paying close attention to details is the key to good sampling technique. Keep records of any unusual observations at time of sampling. Begin sampling by opening the cold water tap and letting the water run for 2 minutes or until the water temperature stabilizes to clear the surface line. This time can be used to fill out a label or tag. Always use waterproof ink. The sample forms can also be filled out immediately following the collection of the sample, which should be completed as soon as possible to ensure the information is accurate. Set the flow and rate things neither too fast nor too slow. Too fast means that the water might splash and introduce contamination not originally found in the water. Too slow simply means that the sample bottle or cap are exposed to potential contamination more than they need to be. Make sure that the flow is consistent and steady. Do not alter the flow once you've begun the process, as it might dislodge biofilm or scale in the line. When the bottle lid is removed, pull its threads down and do not touch the inside of the cap. Remember that the inside of the cap and bottle have been sterilized. Do not set the cap down or place it in a pocket. If the bottle lid becomes contaminated, it may contaminate the sample. Do not rinse out the bottle before collecting the sample, and do not touch any portion of the inside of the bottle. Although not required by regulations, wearing gloves during the sampling process is recommended. Now, collect the sample from the according to the type of sample container used. If you make a mistake, discard the sample bottle and select a new one and start over. When finished, carefully replace the bottle lid, tighten, and place in the cooler on ice or ice packs and out of the sunlight. Keep sample bottles upright and avoid letting them become submerged in melted ice water. Recheck the information on the label and complete any unfinished forms that came with the sample bottle, including the chain of custody form. When transferring, keep the samples at less than 50 degrees Fahrenheit or below 10 degrees Celsius. Total coliform samples must reach the testing laboratory within 30 hours. Samples may be delivered to the lab or sent via overnight delivery. The samples must be analyzed within 30 hours of the sampling regardless of when they are delivered. Any sample not processed within the required time frame will be rejected, so note the lab schedule and whether they are closed on weekends and or holidays. If a sample is rejected by the lab or lost during transport to the lab, recollect a replacement sample at the same sample location as soon as possible. If any routine sample is identified as total coliform positive, repeat sampling is required, as well as a check for the presence of E. coli. Repeat sampling must be done within 24 hours of finding a total coliform positive result. At least 3 repeat samples must be collected and analyzed. Access to extra sample bottles is needed to allow this to occur. One repeat sample must be collected from the same tap as the original sample. Another must be collected within 5 service connections upstream, and the third from within 5 service connections downstream. Clearly label each sample. Repeat sampling does not confirm or deny the original positive coliform sample. It is designed as follow-up action to make sure that nothing more serious is happening at that location in the distribution system. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency also requires public notification when a maximum contaminant level, or MCL, violation occurs. In situations of acute MCL violations, the public must be notified within 24 hours. If a monthly MCL violation occurs, the public must be notified as well. An acute MCL violation occurs when E. coli is detected in only 2 positive coliform samples from the original and repeat sample. Phoenix, New York, located in northern central New York State, is home to about 2,200 residents, most of whom never gave their drinking water much thought until the utility received notice of positive coliform test samples from the distribution system.
So the day when we actually had to call Clinton and have them back to the account, it was positive E. coli. It was not confirmed after that, but to be safe. So the awareness level of the community was quite strong, and they wanted to make sure that the water quality was good.
They began including the sample procedures and locations, and found problems. Poor sampling techniques, coupled with improperly maintained sampling sites, were cited as contributing factors to the problem.
The water may not be bad, but the instrument that comes out could be dirty, and it will give you a positive reading on hurricane. It leads to lack of confidence in your system and in your operator.
Improving the testing sites and training samplers in correct testing fundamentals help restore confidence in the monitoring data, thus restoring a strong sense of confidence in the community's water quality. Clean, safe water of consistent quality and supply is the goal of every water supplier. And while we cannot routinely test every drop of water produced for every possible contaminant, we can assess the overall integrity of the water system's multiple barriers using indicators. Even though effective water treatment procedures may be carefully practiced, it is still important to regularly check the final finished product within the distribution system. And the only way to accomplish that is through reliable and representative system sampling conducted, tested, and retested on an ongoing basis. Here are 3 points to always remember. First, trained sample collectors are very important to having a reliable monitoring program. Second, clean and maintained sample taps and very good techniques for collecting samples from faucets are as important as the sample collector. And third, being ready to respond effectively with positive coliform samples and to investigate causes for positives is essential to have confidence in and securing a water distribution system that is safe from contamination. An organized, efficient, and effective sampling program for total control is an integral part of a water supplier's toolkit in assuring the protection of the public health.
All right, let's take a 15-minute break, and then we will come back and discuss.